Hi, welcome to this week's video. My name is Paul. So this week, as you can see, back to watercolor landscape painting. And this is going to be a very loose wet in wet style painting. If you're new to watercolor and you're maybe not familiar with the term wet in wet, it just means that I've soaked the surface of the paper before I put any paint onto the paper. So I just use a little spray bottle and a brush just to soak the paper with clean water. To me, I sometimes described wet in wet painting as like driving a car on an icy road. You're in control, but maybe not always 100% in control all of the time. There's always an element of chaos in there. And that's definitely how I feel about painting wet in wet. And maybe that's why some people love it and some people really don't enjoy painting wet in wet. They want to be in control all of the time. There's kind of two reasons why I enjoy painting wet in wet. The first one is I feel it gives a looser, more impressionistic final result, which is the kind of painting style that I enjoy. And then the other reason is, and you will agree with this, but I feel that painting wet in wet, you're kind of embracing watercolor painting, the medium of watercolor. Watercolor has these effects like blooms and things that are unique to watercolor. But to really get those effects, you have to use wet in wet sort of techniques. You need to use lots of water. So I feel that paintings that don't use any wet in wet techniques, watercolor paintings, they're maybe not fully embracing the watercolor medium. It's just my opinion. The other thing about this painting is, and this channel in general, is I wanted to get away from the usual social media sort of feeling or look where everything is perfect. There are never any mistakes, nothing ever goes wrong. Everything is right, everything is perfect first time. At least that's sometimes the impression that you get when you watch YouTube channels and things. And as you can see here, about 5 minutes or so into the painting, I decided I didn't like the direction it was going in. So there's kind of two things I can do here. I could just give up and go away, or I could try and start again. Now with watercolor, you can see I use some tissue paper to smudge and wipe off some of the paint. But with watercolor, you're never going to completely get back to white paper. You're always going to get some staining of the paper, especially with darker colors like the darker blues I was using. But I can smudge it back to the point where it's almost a new painting again. So like I said, I just wanted to show this because I know that when you're getting started and things don't always work out perfectly first time, and you look at everybody else on YouTube or whatever, and they seem to just effortlessly create these wonderful paintings every time, first time. I'm going to say that that's probably not the case. There may be a handful of artists who are like that, but most of us mere humans, we make mistakes, things don't work out, we change our mind, things like that happen. And like I said, I just wanted to show you an example of where I changed my mind and decided to change things. It is possible, and don't worry about it. It's perfectly normal. Don't give up, just keep going. So this new composition, if you like, I'm much happier with it at this stage. And the way I'm thinking is, we're standing in a field kind of thing. In the distance there's a field with some crops, maybe wheat or something like that. And maybe that's the crops have ripened and it looks that sort of bright yellow color. So that's the idea that I have in my head. I'm not using any references or anything, so it all is just coming out of my head. Again, as I've said before, sometimes doing it that way, using imagination and memory, can help to loosen up your painting style. If you're using a reference, especially when you're getting started, there is this temptation or this feeling or belief that you have to reproduce what you can see in front of you in the reference. So people will try and reproduce every single blade of grass and every leaf on every tree. And when you're getting started, and maybe if you want to create loose paintings, that's maybe not the best way to do it. So my solution for that was just get rid of all references and just use my memory and some imagination to try and create paintings. And it does follow a kind of a process. So the sky is always first, and then putting in a horizon line, the background, middle ground, and then as you can see, I'm now working on the foreground. And in the foreground, I want to create some sort of implied detail, some feeling that there's detail in the foreground. In the middle and background, there's less detail, and so that helps to create a feeling of depth in the painting. It's a kind of linear perspective. You can see detail in things up close, but things that are further away, it's hard for our eyes to resolve the detail. So if you can recreate that in the painting, it gives a feeling for the viewer that this is a three-dimensional landscape and not just a flat two-dimensional abstract painting. Another thing maybe point out is in the middle ground and the background there's lots of horizontal brush strokes, whereas in the foreground there are more vertical or diagonal brush strokes. It's just because vegetation grows upwards generally, so when you're creating this feeling of detail in the foreground, it's better to use more sort of vertical brush strokes. At this stage, the paper has started to dry out, and you can see me still smudging the pigment with tissue paper, which helps to lift the water off the surface. And because it's drier, I can now use these sort of dry brush techniques, which just means you dip the brush into some paint and then you brush it onto a dryish piece of paper. That way you can get these marks that again suggest maybe vegetation or something growing upwards. So the entire painting doesn't have to be done wet in wet. Most of it is, but you can allow bits to dry out, or you can use tissue paper to dry out parts and then use other techniques like a dry brush technique. I also like this dabbing. This is not a standard watercolor technique, but this dabbing, again, it's that sort of impressionist sort of influence on my painting style. Dabbing on the bright color suggests some flowers or something in the foreground. It basically just suggests details, which helps to make the foreground stand out from the middle ground and the background. And then another technique is scratching the paper, again to create a feeling of detail. At this stage of the painting, this is where it's quite easy to overwork the painting. So there is a point at which you have to decide, I'm going to stop here, I'm not going to add anything else in. You can keep adding things in, you can keep putting more layers of paint and things, but the final result can look as though it's overworked. There's too much there. So at some point you have to stop yourself. And at this point I decided to stop. So this is then just a scan of the final painting. You can see, if you look at where the sky and the land meet, you can see some of those wet in wet effects. What happens with the wet in wet is, if you put the pigment onto wet paper, the pigment will start to spread out in that uncontrolled way, that sort of slightly chaotic way. But that can create effects that look like hedgerows and things like that. It creates interesting shapes and lines. Like I said, these are effects that you can't easily recreate with any other medium. They're kind of unique to watercolor. In the foreground, once it dries out, another thing about watercolor is, as the paint dries, it fades a little bit, so the color kind of dulls down as the pigment sinks into the paper a little bit. So you can see in the foreground where I dabbed on the bright yellow, some of those areas have kind of faded a little bit. It's something to bear in mind when you're painting. It may look very vivid as you put the paint on, but as it dries, it may dull down a little bit. So overall, I was happy with the final painting. I was happy that I did decide to change the composition, even though I was sort of 5 or 6 minutes into the painting. It was a good decision to make. I prefer this final painting. And if there's any sort of message from this video, it's kind of, don't assume that every artist produces wonderful paintings without any effort, without any problems or mistakes or changing their mind. I know it appears that way on YouTube or other social media, but I guarantee it's not the reality for most artists. So don't let it put you off. If you're struggling at the start, struggling is all part of trying to become a painter, trying to be an artist. Well, if you made it this far in the video, thank you for watching, and hopefully see you in the next video.